Okay, what I'm going to be doing is talking about a number of topics that are current and providing some background and details on them. They're going to include gerrymandering, uh, eliminating somebody from the state Supreme Court, primaries, and the whole process that we're about to enter with getting delegates to the Republican and Democratic National Convention. Also planning on talking about the lawsuits that the former president is facing and dealing with that. Okay, so gerrymandering, just an overview here. The most recent election that we've had in Wisconsin has been one where there has been a generally, except for the Ron Johnson bid for the United States Senate, Democrats have done well. Sometimes it's by a narrow margin, 51%. Doug LaFollette, who actually has now resigned, as you probably know, as Secretary of State, actually didn't get even 50%, but he got a plurality in running for re-election as Secretary of State. And if you take all of the votes cast for legislators, state legislators, 52.9% went for Democrats. Nonetheless, there's a big difference in terms of there's a difference between the percentage of votes that go to Democrats and the percentage of seats that they win. And that's the essence of gerrymandering. In terms of our United States representatives, the House of Representatives, we have 8 congressional districts. Republicans are in 6 of those and Democrats 2. The Assembly, they were aiming, understandably, for a 2/3 majority. They didn't get that. It came close. But they've got a substantial majority in the Assembly. They have a substantial majority in the Senate. And in fact, in the Senate, we don't elect all of our senators every time, of course. But the totals, the current situation is where Democrats have 11, Republicans have 22. So they do have, they meaning the Republicans do have a majority. I mean, a 2/3 majority there. If we sort of take a step back and look at gerrymandering generally, a question that I get asked a lot, understandably, is where did that term come from? And it came from Massachusetts, from Governor Elbridge Gerry, who maneuvered he maneuvered the boundaries in Massachusetts so that the Jeffersonian Republicans, actually it's not the current Republican Party, but the Jeffersonian Republicans won 49% of the votes in the election, and yet they got 29 out of 40 seats in their state Senate. One of the political cartoonists in Massachusetts came up with the term gerrymandering by taking taking the boundaries that were established by the governor for electing state senators and said, wow, that looks a lot like a salamander to me. But it was done by Governor Gerry, and he kind of put together the two terms, mander, like in salamander, and Gerry is in the governor. Now, we've had over the years a number of different concerns regarding gerrymandering. One of the ongoing concerns and initial ones that's been very important is the urban-rural. It used to be that districts, for example, in Wisconsin, were really the boundaries were the same as counties. We had fewer counties initially than we do now. They've been added, of course, over the years. And counties don't always have the same, I mean, those are arbitrary boundaries for counties, right? And you don't have the same number of people in each county. And over the years, there became a real imbalance, not only in Wisconsin, but in other states, between the number of representatives in, there was a mismatch, let's put it that way, that you'd have sometimes one particular senator or representative would have constituents that would number as many as like 40,000, and others it would be more like around 400. Well, there were two key United States Supreme Court cases, Baker versus Carr and Reynolds v. Sims, that put an end to that and established what we often refer to as the one person, one vote standard. Baker versus Carr came out of Tennessee, big imbalance, even worse than Wisconsin's. And Reynolds v. Sims came out of Alabama. The distinction between those two cases is that in Reynolds v. Sims, Alabama basically said, well, you know, we'd like to do in our state government what the federal government does, and that is have our Senate based on arbitrary geographic areas without regard to population. And then we'll go ahead and do the Baker versus Carr one person, one vote standard so that there's equal representation in our assembly seats or House of Representatives, as it's often referred to at the state level, as well as the federal. And the Supreme Court basically said, no, that's not going to work. There is no standard, there's no basis for having a kind of sovereignty for state Senate districts like we have for US Senate districts. So it's got to be one person, one vote for as many houses as you've got. Nebraska has one, but everybody else has got two. So that standard is pretty well established and pretty well accepted. Racial bases for gerrymandering had been around, well, really since the Civil War, but became extreme and a major kind of concern, particularly as we get into the 1980s. And there's the famous I-85 district in North Carolina that got challenged, and the US Supreme Court basically took a look at that and said, you can't have an imbalance, even if you've got one person, one vote. Generally, if you've got an imbalance in terms of race, that's not going to do it. I-85 district was one where the congressional district had a very narrow strip of the houses on either side of I-85 were in that particular congressional district. Well, I mean, that if you're talking about democracy, representation, people having a representative, or the representative having a constituency that made any sense, it certainly didn't make it when you had a very busy interstate going right through the district. Partisan gerrymandering is what is currently, there still is concern about racial gerrymandering, by the way. Case in Alabama has just been, it's been decided, but Alabama has not complied yet. So that's still in the news and still a concern. But partisan has been a recent concern in terms of court cases and various kinds of activity. The Gill versus Whither case actually comes out of Wisconsin. And a major concern there was that a number of Supreme Court justices, Justice Kennedy most prominently, essentially were saying, well, you know, if you're talking about a concern as to whether or not Republicans or Democrats are getting advantaged by the way boundaries are established, that's very difficult to deal with. How are you going to be able to really apply a concern there? And Wisconsin, this particular case was one where the concept of efficiency or wasted votes was put forward. And Actually, Justice Kennedy was among those on the Supreme Court that said, well, okay, that makes sense, that if you've got a situation where your congressional representative, for example, is established and it's by 90% of the people who are living in that area, it essentially means that any vote from the 50% to the 90%, those are wasted. That's not an efficient use of democracy, efficient use of voting. So yeah, that's something, and we can apply that. We could even use computers to figure that one out. But, and this is the big but, the ruling, and even recently it's been reiterated by the Supreme Court, is that, well, in the Gill versus Whither case, there was a technical issue of that the litigants were not really representing necessarily the whole state. They didn't have standing. They couldn't say that they were the ones who were hurt. That was easy to remedy, but then the Supreme Court has used a different kind of standard, a different concern, and that is that they're saying that the whole issue of districting is a state matter. It's not a federal matter. And so the federal government, including the US Supreme Court, does not have any kind of jurisdiction. We don't have any business. In the Rucho versus Common Cause, the Lamone versus Benesek, those are two cases relatively recently. One was Maryland, where the Democrats had been gerrymandering, and the other one was North Carolina. And it was the Republicans there. And there was some hope that if you took a Democratic gerrymandered state and a Republican gerrymandered state, we'd get the Supreme Court being clear. Well, they were clear, but the way they were clear was to essentially say, this is a state issue. It's not a federal issue. So that puts it back in our court. So these are the assembly districts in Wisconsin. Let me move to a slide that's a little bit clearer to look at, a little fuzzy here too, but you get some idea of what's going on here. One of the issues is, are we using straight lines, or are we have something that's really zigzag, which makes one suspicious that you're drawing a boundary to capture Republicans, for example, here, and keep Democrats on the other side of that line. You get a lot of this happening. Here's a La Crosse one. I don't know if you can see it, but there's this district kind of juts out a little bit. So it's very irregular, kind of almost not quite that salamander effect. You get a lot of that in the Fox Valley area, where the boundaries are very irregular, and it raises a question. I mean, we used to, as I mentioned, Wisconsin used to say, well, what we do is we deal with county boundaries. Well, that may not make sense, but county boundaries are certainly clear, and the county boundaries and the boundaries for the assembly districts are nowhere to be congruent except almost by accident. So we could spend a lot of time on the boundaries and the specifics of where we get these irregular kind of jutting out and inclusion, exclusion kinds of things. But I think you get the idea. This whole issue has been a concern in Wisconsin, a major concern for at least 2 decades. And it has come to the fore since the last election that we had for a member of our state Supreme Court, when Justice Janet Protasiewicz was elected, and the balance of liberal versus conservative switched to favor of the liberals. And during the campaign, Janet Protasewicz, said that she thought that the maps that were being used in Wisconsin were rigged, that they were not fair, made a number of other comments. I suppose in retrospect, one can criticize her and say, well, you probably didn't need to say that, but she did. And she also, on the issue of abortion, indicated that she was not really in favor of limiting the right of women to make decisions over their bodies. Well, one issue that comes up then is, well, in a campaigning, can you have a conflict of interest? Can you say something in a judicial campaign in those states like Wisconsin, where we elect judges, including Supreme Court justices? Isn't that going to present a conflict of interest, so that if a case comes before the court, you've already made up your mind, and that doesn't seem fair? Well, the United States Supreme Court dealt with this issue in 2002. And what they did is they dealt with a case that came out of Minnesota that raised this issue very directly. It's Republican Party of Minnesota versus White. And Justice Scalia, I should point out, as many of us know, is a very, very conservative justice, and very influential because he was articulate, intelligent. He expressed his reasoning very clearly. The Supreme Court, on a 5-4 decision that was written by Scalia, said, no, there's a First Amendment right of candidates to, including judicial candidates, to express their views about various issues and to share what their values are, and to do what Minnesota had done, which was to outlaw that in a clear state law. That was abridging people's First Amendment rights. And then Scalia went on to say, and besides, democracy really depends on voters knowing who they're voting for. And there's nothing wrong with their knowing that a particular judge is inclined a certain way. Now, he made clear that you can't basically say, in the case of Brown versus Black, if that comes before me, I'm going to rule X, Y, Z. So you can't. That's different than basically saying something more general of, there's this value that I hold, and this is something that I would really be applying in the appropriate time. And Justice Protasewicz was clear in stating her values. She was not saying in a particular case that she would rule in a particular way. She was more general. She did say that if the Democratic Party, which had given her a substantial amount of money to run her campaign, was a litigant in a particular case, she would recuse herself and not participate in that case. Well, in the gerrymandering case, the Democratic Party obviously is affected, but it is not a litigant. And if there are abortion cases that come before the court, we're going to probably deal with that same issue. Wisconsin has a state judicial commission, and there is a judicial code of ethics that actually was authored, amended by, and then authored by conservative majority in the state Supreme Court. And that code of ethics basically says that justices are not obliged to recuse themselves if they get donations from a particular source. And justices are, in campaigning, free to express their views. And that was articulated as well. And it should be pointed out that it is not at all unusual for judicial candidates to get donations from partisan groups, from business groups, from labor groups. It's not at all unusual to have justices when they're campaigning to express various views. We've had that kind of case actually with Justice Hagedorn, who it's called Planned Parenthood, a wicked organization who said that Christianity is the only correct religion, is the term that he used. Justice Rebecca Bradley has written articles that have been very homophobic. She has she's used in her campaign Second Amendment kinds of gun clubs, the NRA and the like, have given her money, and she's highlighted their support in her campaigns. So this is something that's been going on, and the Wisconsin Judicial Commission, which deals with ethics violations by justices, did say that they didn't find that Justice Protasewicz had really been unethical in her conduct. Nonetheless, we had this effort really begun by and promoted by the Speaker of the Assembly, Robin Vos, to remove Justice Protasewicz before she's even cast a vote. But so it's got to be based on her campaign statements and her campaign support. So let's review quickly how you can remove a Supreme Court justice. Since justices are elected, they are subject to recall. And recall, as those of us who remember the recall effort against Governor Scott Walker know, a recall is started by a petition, and you get a number of voters, registered voters, to sign a petition, and that starts the recall. So it's by popular vote. The kicker, if you're wanting to remove Justice Protasewicz, is you have to wait until somebody has served 1 year in their office before you can even file for a recall. Impeachment is what Speaker Vos is suggesting. That is done by the legislature. The process is that the Assembly, by a majority, begins the process. If they vote to impeach an elected official, including a Supreme Court justice, then that person may no longer have authority. They don't have authority to act in their position. The impeachment then goes. The motion then goes to the Senate, and the Senate has to, by a 2/3 vote, uphold and say that, okay, that individual is impeached. Very similar to the process that's used in the federal government and in most states. The Republicans do have the votes to proceed with this process. Like with recall, impeachment is supposed to be there for people who are doing something inappropriate, but it's not specific enough so that they don't have to meet a particular substantive test. The issue here is really the votes. The legislature also can do something which is removal by address. They're not really considering that right now, in part because that is something where you've got to specify exactly why the individual should be removed. And there it's supposed to be for corruption, or that they have a physical or mental inability to proceed in their duties. And then the individual that's the subject of the removal by address is allowed to offer a defense. This is a more deliberative process, more specific process, and it requires a 2/3 vote in both chambers. And if you're looking at it just from a partisan standpoint, the assembly does not have quite 2/3 majority of Republicans. Something else that is a possibility is removal by the state Supreme Court itself. The process there is that the Supreme Court justices would say to the Wisconsin Judicial Commission, please investigate the following person and the following issues and get back to us. The Judicial Commission then makes a recommendation. It's not a requirement kind of thing, but they then make a recommendation, and then the justices will vote on whether or not to remove a particular individual. In a kind of almost comedy-like scenario that you could imagine, the current state Supreme Court could quickly go to the Judicial Commission, and which does consist of a majority of people who have been appointed by Governor Evers, and say, quick, get us a recommendation, and then they could vote and they could remove one of the conservatives, so that if indeed Justice Protasewicz was then impeached, you could still maintain a liberal majority over a conservative. They would have to do that now before she would be impeached, because once she's impeached, or once the assembly votes, not even the Senate, she no longer can cast votes as a Supreme Court justice. And then, of course, there's recusal. And Wisconsin laws and the Wisconsin Ethics Code makes it clear that that's up to the individual. That would be an individual decision by whomever is the subject of a controversy. It's up to them to recuse themselves, and recusal is for a specific case. It's not generally something that is going to be for all duties that would exist. I'm going to talk about the process. Well, let me go ahead and do it, and then we can pause and see if people have got comments or wisecracks. Okay. So one of the most recent moves, in fact, just happened last week by the Republican legislature, is to say, well, okay, impeachment may be messy. We may not have all of the votes we need for impeachment, but we really want Justice Protasewicz to leave, and we want this to kind of, we want a different kind of issue. So what they've done is they've raised the possibility of having a redistricting done in a different kind of way. And the model that has been talked about, and this has been talked about for years, is, well, let's do what Iowa has done. In 1971, the League of Women Voters in Iowa lodged a suit they went to the Iowa Supreme Court that said that, boy, the redistricting process in Iowa was very politicized, and their concern was mainly that it protects incumbents. So it wasn't so much necessarily a partisan or racial, it was more, it's an Incumbent Protection Act kind of thing. And the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, you're right. And in response, what the Iowa legislature did is they passed the process that I'm about to describe. They established a legislative services agency, very much like our Legislative Reference Bureau. These are individuals who are hired by the legislature, and their mandate is to act in a nonpartisan way and provide analyses and various kinds of services to the legislature. And like I say, Wisconsin has such an agency, Legislative Reference Bureau, Legislative Audit Bureau is another one. The Legislative Services Agency then draws up the map. They're the ones who establish the boundaries for the various electoral districts. And they give it to what is called a temporary redistricting advisory commission. This consists of 5 members, 2 appointed by the Republican leader in the legislature, 2 by the Democratic leader in the legislature, and the 5th person who is to chair the commission is somebody that the other 4 can agree on and appointed by them. They then review what the Legislative Services Agency has come up with and report to the legislature. The legislature then may not make any changes. They take the maps as they have been presented and either approves them or rejects them. If they reject them, then the Legislative Services Agency has to submit new maps. And then they're submitted a second time to the legislature, which again, you can't make any changes. And the legislature either approves or rejects. If they approve, it goes on to the governor for the governor's signature. If they reject, the Legislative Services Agency goes back to the drawing board and draws new maps and presents it to the legislature for a 3rd time. If that happens, then the legislature treats the maps like they do any other bill in the legislature, which means that they can amend it, they can do whatever in terms of approval, rejection, and amendment. If the legislature and the governor do not approve, and there's a stalemate and nothing takes place after these 3rd set of maps, then the Iowa Supreme Court takes over and they establish the idea is they would probably set up some kind of commission of their own to have them report to the Supreme Court, and they would then approve whatever the maps are going to be. Typically, the legislature approves the Legislative Services Agency maps first time around. This last iteration, the legislature did not approve the maps, specifically the maps dealing with the congressional district boundaries. The Republicans control both houses of the legislature, also the governor, and the Republican Senate said that they thought that this was not an appropriate map, and suggested that the LSA, the Legislative Services Agency, go back to the drawing board. Legislative Service Agency did do that. They submitted a new set of maps, and it was approved on the second submission. The concern that has been raised, and that you can probably anticipate, is that this whole process is really a legislative process, and it is one that, given the certain composition of the legislature, if you've got one party that has significant majorities in both houses, they can go through the motions of first set of maps, reject, second set of maps, reject, third set of maps, go ahead, amend it the way you want to, and then proceed. So you just get a delay more than anything else. The kind of fail-safe provision that was talked about is our Wisconsin legislature dealt with this issue was that, well, if they are rejected, it's got to be rejected by a 3/4 majority, not 2/3 or just a majority. That was not included in the bill that was passed last week. Now, another model, and I should point out that the Iowa model is unique in that it's done pretty much entirely within the legislature and relies on a legislative agency, in this case, the Legislative Services Agency, to do the map drawing. Michigan on the other hand, has a process which is more common among those states that have a process that is supposed to take a lot of the redistricting out of the hands of legislators in a partisan kind of process. In 2018, there was an initiative. In other words, it came from the people petition. We don't have the initiative in Wisconsin. There was a direct initiative to amend the Constitution in Michigan to establish what is called an Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. This commission has exclusive authority to set the boundaries of the congressional districts. They call it the House of Representatives, we call it the Assembly, and the state Senate districts. The commission consists of 13 members. Citizens who are registered voters apply to be on the commission. In order to apply, you cannot and be considered, you cannot have been a candidate or have been elected during the last 6 years. There are a number of other categories where you can't have been a lobbyist, you can't have been a professional staffer for a partisan candidate, a number of others that in categories where you can't really be considered. That once you have the pool, then 13 people are chosen randomly with the idea that 4 people would be affiliated with the Republican Party, 4 with the Democratic Party. And I should stop here and remind you that in Michigan, as opposed to Wisconsin, when you register to vote, you have to indicate what party you want to be affiliated with. So they've got a record of registered Republicans, registered Democrats. A lot of people in Wisconsin kind of try and say, "Oh, I'm a loyal Democrat, and I'm a registered Democrat." Well, if you're a registered Democrat, you're not in Wisconsin because there's no opportunity to do that. And then 5 people would be not affiliated with either party. So they would be registered voters, but they would not be affiliated. So that's the process that's used in Michigan. It was used in establishing the current boundaries that exist. Michigan, that whole initiative was a response to gerrymandering that had been very blatant and very obvious in Michigan for a couple of decades, somewhat like Wisconsin. It had favored the Republicans. This process that they just went through, interestingly, gave Democrats the majority in both houses of their legislature and in their congressional delegation. Not overwhelming majorities, but it was basically they have much more competitive kinds of districts than they had before. So I promised that I would stop for a while and let people raise their hand, or I guess we've got some comments in the chat too. Let me go to that first. On what basis other than race can a nonpartisan voter challenge Wisconsin's gerrymander before the U.S. Supreme Court? None. Yeah, it's sort of, there was an attempt, but Justice Kennedy initially said, well, you can't challenge it because we can't figure out what a fair way of having maps is. And then the court in Roberts has been very clear on this, sort of like, if it's not racial gerrymandering, then we're not considering it. I guess the only other basis would be if it's not a one person, one vote situation. If you had, there's kind of a informal acceptance of a leeway of about a 1% variation, but you've really got to be, it's really got to be one Okay. This, oh, Ken said he couldn't hear me. Is that a general problem?
I don't think so. I did check in with him, Dennis, and his volume came back to normal.
Okay, okay, good. Um, let's see. Okay. Can I comment on, is gerrymandering consistent with the Wisconsin Constitution, or is it just a question of consistency with the law? Well, I think we're probably going to find that out with the two cases that are going before the Wisconsin State Supreme Court. The court could, the state Supreme Court has the option of deciding cases in accordance with the US Constitution, but their primary responsibility is to see if they're apply the state Constitution. And the answer to the question is really going to be determined by the fate of those cases before the state Supreme Court. Who chooses the Michigan citizens? They are chosen randomly. So the Secretary of State in Michigan is the one who does the mechanics. And when they are chosen randomly, the Secretary of State is obliged by this constitutional provision that they passed to make sure that the random selection doesn't take place until there are enough. Let's see, let me do this kind of in order here. There's a minimum number of people who have to be volunteering to be on the commission. Then you have to, the Secretary of State has to make sure that there's a minimum number of people who are affiliated, registered with the Republicans, registered with the Democrats, and not registered with either party. And there is also, and this is a more vague thing, is that the Secretary of State has to be sure that they're coming from throughout the state, that they're the different urban areas and rural areas throughout the state. So it's a kind of thing that you would do if you were doing a random sampling for almost any other kind of for polling or any other kind of purpose. But once the pool is met that kind of criteria, then it's purely random selection. Why do the Democrats not like the latest, like the Iowa redistricting proposal? I think it's primarily because it really, unlike other states, this is a process that is pretty much controlled by the legislature, and the legislature is controlled by the Republican Party. And I think that the Democrats, that one way of stating it is that you would have a gerrymandered legislature determining the gerrymander, whether or not the new state maps are gerrymandered at all. And that doesn't pass a kind of credibility test. Let's see here. Has gerrymandering become more extreme in recent years, or is it a higher profile merely because of the current climate of hyperpartisanship? Partisan gerrymandering has become more visible and has become in more extreme in some cases, not all. It's certainly become more extreme in Wisconsin. no question about that. It certainly has been more extreme in Maryland by the Democrats there. So there are some states, not all of them, where it has become really very, very high profile, but also very extreme in terms of the percentage of seats that, the difference, this whole kind of issue of wasting votes, as it's often referred to, or efficiency of voting, because you've got some districts that are packed with one party and others that the other party really doesn't have a reasonable chance of getting. Why didn't another objection to the Voss proposal is the opportunity for public input. That's true. The specific proposal that was voted on by the Republicans in the past week, there weren't any hearings. There was 48 hours between the time that he said, well, let's do this Iowa model, and they voted on it. So that it was rushed through, and that always, it raises suspicions, right? Why didn't the Democrats redraw the maps when they had a chance? There have been people asking that question for 2 decades now. I don't know. It's some people blame the leadership, hindsight. I don't have a good answer beyond that. Let's see. Alabama has gerrymandered districts, has been told to redo maps, but the U.S. Supreme Court, by the U.S. Supreme, but by the U.S. Supreme, and Alabama has not complied. That's true, and it's something that we're not sure exactly what the U.S. Supreme Court is going to do. One probability, and I say probability, is that the U.S. Supreme Court will set up some process, some commission or consultants, and they will draw the maps and said, this is what you're using. U.S. Supreme Court has been involving itself in gerrymandering only on racial grounds. Can gerrymandering in Wisconsin be construed as racial in nature by the numbers, that is? Actually, this U.S. Supreme Court did mandate the changes in the congressional districts that were proposed in the most recent maps, and it was racial. It was primarily a situation where the Hispanic community in the Milwaukee area did not have a real opportunity of electing people from their community. Have other states adopted the Iowa model, or is it only Iowa? It is only Iowa. And as far as I know, there has not been really a significant move in other states to adopt the Iowa model. So there's been much more of a fascination with Iowa by people in Wisconsin than other states. See if I've got all the questions here in the chat line. Chattering. I think that's it. So why don't we proceed? And if I missed one, just has Michigan been copied? Not yet. I should point out Michigan has copied, so that would be one way of responding, but there really hasn't been much time since the Michigan changes were made. And I realize, that's 5 years ago, but that the other states have really not. I mean, again, the Michigan model was adopted by virtue of the direct initiative, and we don't have a direct initiative, and that's how most of the nonpartisan processes in other states have been established, not by the legislature, but by direct initiative. Yeah, it's been pointed out, and I thought I made this, but let me make it clear. The proposal that the Republicans passed last week is not really the Iowa model. They call it the Iowa model. The part of the Iowa process that is copied in the Wisconsin Republican proposal is the beginning with this legislative services agency. But beyond, and then the first two kind of issues, but it is really not, it's really not getting the legislature to take an arm's length distance away from the process. And the state Supreme Court is also, and Ken is pointed this out, can open that our state Supreme Court is not mentioned in the proposal that was before the Wisconsin legislature, where it is a key part of the Iowa proposal. So, okay. All right. Okay, let's go on and talk a bit about primaries. The whole idea of having primaries began with the progressive era. The progressives were a main reason for the emergence of the progressive era was to destroy political machines and to take away power from machine bosses. And a way of doing that was to establish primaries where voters could directly make sure that people's names got on the ballot, rather than the ballots being designed by the machine bosses. The idea of having primaries sort of existed in Florida and Wisconsin and a number of Midwestern and Northwestern states that were very bound up in the progressive era, established primaries, but they were not really used a whole lot, particularly at the presidential level. That really began, a major change there occurred in 1960 when John F. Kennedy ran for president, and there were only 7 primaries in the United States at that time, presidential primaries, Wisconsin being one of them. And Kennedy wanted to participate in the Wisconsin primary, and there were a lot of people around him who said, oh boy, that's not a good idea, primarily because of the Catholic issue. Wisconsin has enough of a Catholic population, and Catholics were politically active. And so we felt like, well, you know, I need to demonstrate, and actually he was really focusing a lot on the machine bosses who control the nomination process at the time. I need to demonstrate to these bosses that I can win, and that I can win even though I'm Catholic. And so that was a major reason why he got into the Wisconsin primary. It wasn't really to get the number of delegates that Wisconsin would send to the Democratic National Convention. That was, you know, obviously important, but somewhat inconsequential. And in that regard, he was concerned about Wisconsin Democrats' fascination with Adlai Stevenson, who again wanted to be the Democratic nominee, and he wanted to kind of thwart that effort. Likewise, he was concerned about Hubert Humphrey's ambition and felt like, well, it's going to be risky because Wisconsin people like Hubert Humphrey, but if I can win in Wisconsin, boy, is going to demonstrate to the machine bosses that I can win. And the Democrats in large states like Illinois, for example, will get behind my candidacy. And Kennedy immediately went from Wisconsin to West Virginia because he needed to really ramp up and nail this religious issue. West Virginia was a state where it really, the Catholic religion was a liability, considered to be a liability. And so he went to West Virginia and participated in their primary with the same idea. More and more people started using the primary, and there was really more to get delegates to the national convention than a particular issue like religion. And then in 1968, there was this convention in Chicago that the Democrats had that was just a real, there were riots. This was during the Vietnam War. A lot of the issue was Vietnam. The assassination of Bobby Kennedy had just occurred, et cetera. And the Democrats said, well, let's establish a commission to be headed by McGovern and Fraser, and they can establish new rules for primaries and establishing the way in which we're going to have a nomination of our presidential candidate. And McGovern, who was co-chair of the commission, then actually used those rules in part to run for president himself. That was, as I'm sure everybody that remembers, it was a disaster, absolute disaster. And so the Democrats got together and they said, okay, that didn't work. We need a new way of dealing with it. And so in 1976, the Democrats basically said, primaries, especially the kind of primaries like you've got in Wisconsin, are really not acceptable because they're open and anybody who's a registered voter can vote. It doesn't make any difference if they're a Democrat or Republican. And so people can come into the Democratic primary and spoil our chances by voting for somebody who's going to be a weak candidate in the general election. So they really put down rules that really disadvantage states like Wisconsin who relied on a primary, and they favored caucuses where you could close the caucus or close the primary, but they wanted it closed. And there were a number of key Supreme Court cases. Well, it was a Wisconsin State Supreme Court case over this whole issue, where it was kind of Democratic Party of the United States versus La Follette defending the Wisconsin open primary. The Democratic Party coming in and saying, no, we're really in charge here. We're talking about the National Democratic Party convention, and that's under our purview. La Follette saying, no, you can't do that because you're disenfranchising people in Wisconsin. We've got First Amendment rights of assembly and speech, and you're really compromising those. The case then went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Wisconsin State Supreme Court upheld the open primary. The U.S. Supreme Court sided with the National Democratic Party and said, well, we understand the issue of free speech and all that, but the parties, Democrat, Republican, whatever, those are really not governmental entities. So it's not that, the First Amendment is really the government curtailing free speech, not a particular institution. And parties are private institutions. In this case, they're private institutions established to run candidates in an election. The Democratic Party can really establish its own rules. And so what Wisconsin did, and it was a very awkward kind of situation initially, is we had both a caucus and a primary, with the idea that the caucus was supposed to pay attention to what happened in the primary. And it was just, it was messy. And the Democratic National Committee essentially backed off and said, okay, have your primaries the way you want to. We don't like it, but go ahead. And let me point out, we'll get to this point a little bit later. There are differences between presidential and non-presidential primaries in terms of being partisan and non-partisan and like. The closing elections is something that's really primarily an issue in the presidential primaries, but it's not. National Democratic Party doesn't determine what happens when we have other primaries. And just a quick reminder, Wisconsin has both partisan and nonpartisan primaries. We have our nonpartisan primary in April and nonpartisan elections. And then we've got our partisan ones in November. So there are different kinds of primaries. There's a closed primary, which essentially means that you've got to be registered as a member of the party before you can vote in that party's election. And these are the states that have a closed primary. Good number of them, of course. There are some states that are semi-closed. Illinois, for example, has a semi-closed. And in the semi-closed primary, what happens is that you can go to when you go to the ballot box and cast a vote in a primary, you can change your primary, you can change your registration at that point. And you can register at that point if you haven't registered for any party before. So if I'm in Arizona and I'm a registered Republican, but I feel like, gee, I'd rather vote for X candidate who's running in the Democratic primary, I can ask for a Democratic primary ballot. And in doing so, I have to then change my registration. And I will then, until I change it back to, I will be known as a registered Democrat. So that's the semi-closed. The open primary, like we have in Wisconsin, is one where, and this is what we've all experienced, you don't ask, you determine at the time you cast your primary vote, which primary you're going to vote in. You can't vote in both at the same time, of course. You can't say, well, I'm going to vote for so-and-so in the Republican primary and so-and-so in the Democratic primary. You've got to make a choice, Democrat or Republican, but you can do that. You do that when you show up to vote. The caucuses are very few now. Fewer and fewer states have caucuses. There are Republican caucuses in District of Columbia, Kentucky, and Ohio. And then those states have, for the Democrats, they've got, like Ohio's got a semi-closed primary. So there, it makes a difference which party you're talking about. But for both parties in Iowa, Nevada, North Dakota, and Wyoming, they have a caucus. And a caucus is essentially people get together in somebody's home. I remember when we had caucuses, the time we had a caucus in Wisconsin, going to a church, and they were hosting the caucus. And then you essentially have an opportunity to say, I'm voting for so-and-so, and I encourage everybody else to do it. So you can have some discussion, you can have some debate. the different caucuses will have rules on how long you can talk, just to sort of move things along. But it's whoever shows up. Clearly, they're closed, and in a way, they're kind of semi-closed, aren't they? Because you really, when you show up, you're showing up in the living room or church basement or whatever of people who are of a particular party. So those are the different kinds that we've got. Now, it's important to take a look at the calendar. The Democratic Committee, the Democratic National Committee, has thrown a little bit of a monkey wrench into the calendar in that they have said that they are not going to recognize anybody who becomes a delegate as a result of a caucus or a primary before South Carolina has their primary on February 3rd. Now, the Iowa Democrats have said, we're going ahead and we're going to have our caucus. And the New Hampshire Democrats have said, we're going to go ahead with our primary. And the question is will those delegates that come out of that primary and that caucus be seated at the national convention by the Democrats? Or will they even be allowed into the room, into the convention at all? That's up to the Democratic Party. And as I mentioned with the Supreme Court case that occurred, the Democratic Party is being treated legally as a private organization and they can do what they want to do. So we've got these, that's the issue with the beginning of the primary this coming January. And then we've got Nevada is going to have a Democratic primary and a Republican caucus. They're going to be close together, but on different days. Most of the time, it's going to be like it is in Michigan, where you have a primary by both parties on the same day. The Republicans are going to have a caucus in addition to their primary, which they can certainly do, and be a certain number of delegates that come out of each one of those. March 5th is what is referred to as Super Tuesday, and you can see why it's Super Tuesday. The number of delegates is, number of states, and these are all primaries. That's Super Tuesday. We'll get to this in a little while, but I should point out that March 5th is the day after one of the court cases that Trump is scheduled for. So he's going to be a busy guy, perhaps. Then we have March 12th and starts out a number of other primaries, and in the 19th. And an important point to keep in mind here is that from March 15 onward, all of the Republican primaries have to be winner take all. Prior to March 15th, it's up to the state Republican Party. If they want to have it winner take all, that's up to them. But the National Party has said from March 15th onwards, it's winner take all. And a reminder, when Donald Trump is run for the nomination, the first time and the second time, he was greatly advantaged by the winner take all provision because he was just winning a plurality in most of the primaries. The Democrats are very clear and very strict. All primaries are proportional. You get the number of delegates depending on how well you do in the primary or in the caucus. Wisconsin's primary is April 2nd. Then we've got some caucuses and primaries after that. Skip through this, but you get the general idea. And the convention for the Republicans is in Milwaukee, as we probably all know. July 15th through the 18th. And then a month later, the Democrats meet in Chicago, hopefully with a very civil kind of convention, not like they had in 68. Now, the Republicans, they have a total number of delegates is 2,467. Most of these are pledged delegates. There are some that are unpledged. Unpledged are, for the most part, officials, people who are governors or senators, but elected officials or party officials. But most of them are clearly pledged delegates, and this is the number that they need to win. With the Democrats, their current rules are a little bit more complicated. They have 3,979 total delegates, and in order for someone to win on the first ballot, they don't need to have more than 1,991, but only pledged delegates are allowed to vote. They have unpledged, or what are often referred to as superdelegates, and the superdelegates are governors, federal legislators, that kind of thing. And the superdelegates are not allowed to vote unless there's no winner on the first ballot. So that presents an interesting kind of dynamic there. In terms of accumulating the number of delegates, sort of in mid-March, assuming that somebody's doing well on these various primaries and caucuses, the Republicans, if you're a Republican candidate, things are going to get wrapped up in sort of mid-March. Same thing for the Democrats. This is often referred to as front-loading, so that it becomes important if you're a candidate to be thinking about this calendar, trying to get delegates as soon as you possibly can, so that by the time June comes around, or even April or May, it may be that the primaries and the caucuses are entirely moot. I mean, they still send delegates to the conventions, but they don't have an impact on the presidential nominating process. Now, you might say, why are we talking about the primaries? Hasn't Trump established front runner kind of position? Isn't Biden running for re-election? And that's a good question. I don't have a great answer to that, except to say that who knows what might happen. We've got the background here. If something does happen, it would not be something that would be expected right now or predicted right now. But I can't help but comment that I have very little confidence in the polling that's being done right now. It's too early. The way the polling is being done doesn't really provide a lot of confidence that the Republican and Democratic process is really basically done, that it's a matter of going through the motions. I just don't believe that. And who knows? I mean, it's fun to speculate, and more fun to think about something else happening. Why don't I stop there for a while and see about comments that you've got. Nevada will be having a primary on February 6th. I'm not sure about that. It won't be. And yeah, right. Yep. Okay. Yeah, comment about 14th Amendment versus Trump on the ballot in the primary. Yeah, I was going to talk about that as part of the sort of his legal problems, but yeah, let's go ahead and take that now because it is somewhat separate from the cases where he's been indicted. Interestingly, we have had a number of conservative, and I mean very conservative scholars who have started this speculation and started this notion that Trump really should not appear on primary ballots. Trump should not appear on any ballot because Article 3 of the 14th Amendment says that if you have participated in an insurrection against the United States, then you're not qualified to be an elected official. And the January 6th incident certainly, and some of the legal issues really describe and provide evidence that Trump is someone who participated in an insurrection. One response to that is, well, there may be some issues in terms of defining insurrection. This was the 14th Amendment, Article 3, was a response to the Civil War and an effort to make sure that people who had participated in the Civil War said that that they can't be in it and elected. The other side of it, which is perhaps a bit more substantive and a bit of a hurdle, and this has been cited by the Secretary of State in New Hampshire, for instance, who considered this, is that if you read Article 3 of the 14th Amendment, it says that they shall not hold office. It doesn't say that they can't run. They can't be a candidate. And so it may be that you're going to get some judges saying that that they can run, but they just can't hold office. And that would be that would certainly muck things up. It may be that if we do get states saying that Trump can't be on the ballot because of Article 3, and they can use a federal constitutional provision. You don't have to have a state constitutional provision or a state law for keeping Trump off the ballot. They could do that. There is there's the legal issue as to whether or not that's going to be permitted, but there's also a political one, and whether or not. I mean, Trump has certainly he's made a lot of money, as well as made a lot out of being a victim. And this would clearly be, from a political standpoint, would add into his being portrayed as a victim and revving up a lot of support among his base as a victim. So it's not clear what's going to happen. But it is a possibility, and I think it's interesting that this is something that did not come out of liberal legal scholars or scholars kind of generally or jurists. It came out of something proposed by conservative scholars. Let me talk about ranked choice quickly, and then get to some other questions in the chat that are coming in, some really good questions. Ranked choice is not available for presidential elections. It's only for non-presidential. And it's becoming more and more popular. Alaska now uses ranked choice for federal elections, had ranked choice that it used for electing its House of Representatives. Yeah, for U.S. Senate, for state offices, governor and the like. California, Louisiana are using a kind of ranked choice system. And in a way, these are kind of nonpartisan ones. So if you're concerned about partisanship, and this is an attraction for a lot of people, maybe moving to ranked choice makes some sense. In which case, and somewhat, well, I would say silly, but it's getting to be lunchtime, so why not? So the way that you do it is you say, okay, I'm going to rank my choices. So with this particular example, breakfast burrito becomes first choice, the red chili enchiladas is second, and etc. You rank the choices that you want, and then what happens is you take you count the ballots, and you just count the first choices that people made. And if somebody wins with 50% or more on the first ballot, then that's yes, and they are the winner. If, on the other hand, nobody gets 50%, then what you do is you move to this kind of loop in which you eliminate the last place candidate and only the last place candidate. Then you take the second choice of the last place candidate and put those in with the first place votes that the other candidates got. Do the tally again, and now has somebody gotten 50% or more? The answer is yes. We've got a candidate who's been successful. If it's no, then you go through the same process again. You again eliminate the last place candidate, take their choice, their next place votes, and add them in with the first place to see if you get it, and just keep doing that until you get 50% or more. So you can see one of the dynamics that is meant here is that to some extent, you're really taking party label and making that less of a factor. The other thing is that if you're a candidate, you're not sure exactly how you're going to get ranked by the various voters. You probably don't want to really be too shrill or too partisan and not get the second choice votes or the third choice votes, should indeed that be necessary in order to win. So that is an attractive feature as well. Okay, let's talk about Trump and the various trials that he's got. He's got the New York fraud civil trial, which is the trial where he lied. The allegation is that he lied on his taxes and bank statements in order, kind of inflating his worth if he needed a loan or, oops. Let's see. Sorry. There we go. I'll keep my fingers off of that. So he was misrepresenting his worth depending on whether or not he wanted to be taxed or whether or not he wanted a loan. The Jean Carroll defamation suit she's the one that said that she had been sexually molested. The issue here is that Trump was found guilty of defaming. The jury said it didn't have enough evidence to, without any doubt, say that he had actually raped her, but certainly molested her and the like. And he made a number of statements that defamed her. Question now is how much money is he in for? The January 6th insurrection is the one that is being pursued in the Washington, D.C. area. And that's about the insurrection, although I should point out that the case has been not so much focusing on the insurrection itself, but on the conspiracy to inspire to have the insurrection, the efforts to defraud voters by having these fake elector scheme, and the efforts to disenfranchise voters by trying to get states to not report the results correctly. The hush money is that's the Stormy Daniels using campaign money to pay her off and keep her quiet. The Mar-a-Lago is taking classified documents, top secret documents from Washington, D.C. when he left, and keeping them in Mar-a-Lago, and actually even showing them to people who did not have any kind of clearance to look at the documents, and then the Georgia conspiracy. So that, and that has not been scheduled yet. The most recent ruling on that has been that the judge in Fulton County has said that he's not going to have Trump and the other 18 conspirators all tried at the same time. He's going to split it up, and he's going to delay Trump's trial. We're going to get more detail, I think, in October, when the first people who have been indicted in this case will be appearing in court. So these are all on the horizon. It does get into the 14th Amendment, which we talked about, and these are issues that don't seem to be making a whole lot of difference in terms of his constituency base. If anything, they're inclined to give him more money. He's using their money rather than his money to get his defenses. So let me just go through the okay. Judge in Colorado said she will rule by Thanksgiving on whether Trump will appear on the Colorado ballot. Yeah, good. And it'll be interesting, just given these different interpretations that I mentioned. Yeah, the term being primaried. Ironically, what has happened is that the primaries, as I mentioned, is really established to thwart machine bosses and machines generally, and let the people determine who's going to be on the ballot. But in a time when we've got high partisanship and a need for a lot of money, what we've got is a different kind of boss and a different kind of machine that's emerged, so that party discipline in doing what the boss wants to have done is enforced by the notion that, boy, if you don't, if you're an incumbent and you don't do what I say, then I'm going to get a primary candidate. I'm going to get a candidate to run against you in the primary, and this usually comes with I'm going to give monetary support for that and the like. And this term is something that has become more and more used since the 1990s. Donald Trump certainly uses it and used it a lot in the last two elections. Wisconsin, our partisanship increased enormously in the 90s by the then Speaker of the Assembly primarying a member of his own party, a very prominent member of his own party, because she didn't do what he wanted to do. And that became a whole issue that just because you remember the party didn't mean that you were going to be advantaged in any kind of election. So it's been a major development. If Trump is not on the ballot, see, would write-in votes for him be counted as valid? In most jurisdictions, yes. Each jurisdiction and states are really the ones who determine the rules. Have different rules for counting write-in ballots, and in Wisconsin, for example, we have a relatively recent rule that says you can't be silly with a write-in ballot and have it counted if you're going to vote for Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck. So most places will count a write-in ballot, write-in vote, but that in part depends on the state, and in part depends on the party, because remember again that we're dealing with party rules. Do current primary policies essentially eliminate the potential for third parties? Yeah, unless we're dealing with ranked choice. It really has had the effect of that, particularly with this phenomenon we just talked about being primaried. It really has increased partisanship enormously. It really has. The other thing that has contributed to the elimination of a potential for third parties has to do with the gerrymandering. And finally, it's the rules of the various states. I mean, even in Michigan, when I was reading the constitutional amendment that they passed in Michigan, setting up their current system for for redistricting, they make it very clear that, if you recall, they said, you have to have 4 people who are registered Republicans, 4 who are registered Democrats, and 4 who are not registered at all. And in the Constitution of Michigan, it doesn't say Republican or Democrat. It says the top two parties in the legislature. It very specifically says the top 2. So it's not really allowing for a third party, and certainly disadvantages it. The other thing, of course, to remember about our party system is that a major issue is that people really have brand loyalty, and that's what's really driving a lot of the polling, a lot of the partisanship and the like, because people don't really look that much at whether or not somebody is virtuous or got policies that you think are preferred. It's just, are they a Republican or are they a Democrat? And it just has taken on a momentum that's almost irrational. What is required to make ranked voting possible in national elections? A national law. Yeah, it would have to, and this does come up when you have third and fourth party candidates. Very true. It really does take away from the elections. But if we were to have ranked voting possible, let me just revise that. It sort of wouldn't necessarily be a federal law. It would have to be something that states could do it, and you'd have to have some buy-in by the national parties. So again, the national parties are really what's critical in terms of particularly the primaries that determine the delegates who go to the party conventions. And that whole dynamic historically has been what has killed the Progressive Party. I mean, the third and fourth parties, as we refer to them, they've been killed by the national parties, the major parties, Democrats and now the Republicans too, setting up their party rules. So that's an important factor. In Wisconsin, you have to be a registered voter as a write-in candidate in order for your votes to be counted. Good point. Yeah. And Cornell West will be on the Wisconsin ballot as the Green Party candidate. So I'm having trouble getting down the. Huh. Oh, okay. No Labels is trying to get on the Wisconsin ballot. It's another third party movement, and a lot of concern about No Labels, meaning an effort to sort of get away from the candidates, the likely candidates of the major parties. So it's not really a political party, but more of a protest kind of statement. Thanks for a good start to the discussion. And thank you. Well, I guess. Yeah, yeah, and then I should point, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but let me just remind everybody that this and other sessions are being recorded. And they will be on the PLATO website on Thursday, by Thursday. And what you do is you just go up to the upper right hand corner, I think it is, where you can click on past lectures is the label. And there's another PLATO session which is also being recorded. So, and there might be more, but I know that there, this and one other one on, I think, environmental issues. And another question that's come in, I want to comment on alternative Democratic candidates and how they would gain traction, or is Biden a lock? Do I want to comment? You know, it would seem like at this point Biden is a lock. Nobody is coming forward that has the kind of stature or support. Time is running out. It's becoming late. Obviously, if something happens and Biden changes his mind, there'd be a real scramble. I don't think that we would assume that Vice President Harris would necessarily become the leading candidate or the candidate. She might, but I don't think you can make that assumption. But I think you know, the Democrats, you know, like the Republicans, they've got a stable full of some good people, some people who are aspiring to higher office. So I think there are a lot of people there who would take that primary schedule that we were talking about and make that all the more meaningful in terms of the front loading as an issue, whether or not we're dealing with caucuses or primaries, and the issue of the parties, whether or not, I mean, the parties have their deadlines, the electoral commissions have their deadlines, that would have to be met. So there's a lot that would have to be done. Fundraising. Someone wondering if Wisconsin's fake electors may be pursued legally. Absolutely. No, there's, they're going to have a say against that. There is a defense, and they are already coming up with an explanation saying, well, they were just led on, they were misled, that kind of thing. But it is illegal to be a fake elector. That is a way of defrauding, and there is so there's a defrauding, and there's also an obstruction issue, and there is a Wisconsin state law that's at issue. So, and there is our Attorney General has been somewhat reluctant to pursue this, but there is a civil suit that is before Judge Remington. Ken Open has pointed this out, and so we might want to keep our eye on what Judge Remington might rule in that regard. So yeah, it is illegal. And I remember in the immediate aftermath of the election, having discussions with a number of people about the fake electors. It came up very quickly, and it's not something that's just come up. It's been a real concern. So, any other issues or questions? Or, well, again, let me remind you, if you haven't. Oh, I got a hand up.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Dennis, I just wanted to jump in. One member asked if you would be sharing the schedule of the course for this fall at some point. I can post that to the webpage. We can share the chat, or you could email it to the group.
Sure, and we can actually do all of the above. We do have, we don't have everything all lined up. There are a couple of discussions that are ongoing, getting some commitments from some guests. So as soon as we get those commitments, we'll let everybody know. But again, just so people do know, next week we're dealing with the whole issue of DEI. Then on October 3rd, we're dealing with COVID and with Mark Pocan, and Mark is in good health. So it's not that those are related, they're just both on the same day. And then October 10th, we're dealing with a discussion with Judge Draper on political civility. So that should be good as well. And a reminder, if you haven't already, please renew your membership, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.